In this video, I want to talk a little bit about what I think generative art is good at, and by sort of default, by definition, what it's bad at. This isn't to say that like this video is going to be about like, oh, it's good at generating watercolor-like images. Like I think we can kind of already assume that is, but more from like a theoretical or conceptual level, like how I think generative AI is interesting and how I think it's somewhat problematic. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So I think the first thing that's really fascinating and obviously a positive in the way these tools work is you can create anything in the style of anything else, which you know is such a fascinating concept because for so long we've sort of been held to the idea that the style we have today is the style that we get to use, right, as artists. Um, and honestly, even since the very beginning of generative image AI, we've had this concept. One of the very first things that I remember playing with was this concept of style transfer, which was the idea you could take a texture from another image and apply it to the content of another image. So here's Mona Lisa and a couple other famous artistic styles. Now, obviously, quality isn't that good. We're probably way beyond this quality, but from the very outset, like this was a strong reason to create AI tools. Um, and I do think it's interesting in many ways. And obviously, there's some, on the flip side of this, there's obviously some downsides. But the idea that, any of us can now create images in painterly styles or pencil styles or other things is fascinating. I think it gives tools, if you want to talk about these tools as being democratic, it gives you tools that, weren't always available to every single person for whatever reason. But one of the things I found so really interesting out of these tooling is that people have started to create these very crazy matrices of like how all these tools work. And this gets into prompt engineering, and we'll talk about that more as we progress. But the idea that especially with text to image tools, that like little changes of phrase can change the entire style of an image. So a couple years ago, this person, Kingdom Acrylic, went through and made like a ton of different examples of text to image tools that would utilize these sort of different style markers. So just using the style of pencil sketch, you would get a very pencil sketchy image, even though colors would sometimes bleed into it. 8K resolution, which isn't really a style, but has maybe a certain look, that sort of HDR look. 8K 3D, again, some very interesting things that I think we would not necessarily consider artistic styles, but change the images in a stylistic way or an aesthetic way. So we've sort of like always had these tools, and they're getting progressively more and more like tightly coupled with the way the images work. And even tools today, like I was looking at Adobe Firefly recently, and even Firefly has built into their UI some default preset styles. So if you want something with strong bokeh, if you want something with layered paper look, like even hyper realistic, like these are now built into these tools as an expectation. And I think while that's really fascinating and gives us these tools, it is a question of like, what does it mean as artists if we are able to work in any style? And I think for the longest time, artists were told to develop their own style and to develop their own sort of look and feel and their own perspective on their work. And now we're at this point where anyone can make anything. What does that mean? And I think that leads to some of the ideas behind conceptual art, but other things. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how artists who grow up using these tools will actually develop them and use them in their own ways. But I think it's a really fascinating tool, and it does lead to some of the democratization that we see, or again, if we're looking purely optimistically at these tools, like there is a value to this. Another thing I think is really interesting and fascinating, and I'm seeing artists sort of rely on, is this idea of scale. Again, it takes you X number of hours to paint a painting or X number of hours to draw a drawing. And now using these tools, we can generate images almost at the speed of light. It's gotten so fast that it's generally almost real time. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But also, the number of images we can create each time is so fascinating. I remember when I first started using Runway. Runway had this really cool tool where your StyleGAN images would also have this little grid of things where you could begin to sort of see the entire model, and you could begin to pick and choose what your favorite images were. And this was such a fascinating tool to me because it gave me the opportunity to see the scale and the breadth of my models. Now, this is when I was training my own models. This would be slightly different for something like text to image, but you could begin to see an interface where this would be built like this. And I think there's something really fantastic or interesting about seeing the whole scope of these tools all at once and being able to pick and choose certain areas of them. again, this has become almost the default behavior for most of these tools. On the left is Dream Studio, which is from Stable Diffusion. On the right is Firefly. And almost by default, I don't know why 4 is the default, but the default has become sort of you get 4 images every time you give it a text prompt. And those 4 images, one of them might be good, the rest might be garbage, or honestly, at this point, I think all 4 of these are really interesting images. But now we're at this point where like generating all these images takes maybe hours at most. And it's actually given rise to this sort of like, I don't even know if I would call it artistic style, but like maybe a direction for AI artists in what is called long form, which as someone who worked in publishing, I don't like that terminology for this artistic medium, but it's what people are calling it. So it's long form, which is that in a series of pieces, people would make something like 100 or 1,000 different images. And I'd explored this previously in some of my own work using, using generative art, using random noise samplers or sliders, or even in my own artistic work, generating some of these images as well. And it does sort of allow you to create sort of a system within itself. And I think as designers, like we're sort of interested in systems, creating systems that also generate different artistic pieces. This is from K10K, which is Kate Voss's gallery. I think she's been working a lot with artists to sort of expand and create these big pieces. This also kind of ties to crypto, which whole other topic that I won't get into, but the idea you can sell one-off pieces almost as uniques at a price point that's higher than selling editions, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of things happening here. And while I wouldn't necessarily say that it's all positive, I do think there's some really fascinating things that are happening because of this medium. And obviously, as a part of that scale conversation, as I started mentioning, there's also the speed conversation. Even 2 years ago, it used to take me, a couple hours to generate a high-res image. And now we're at this point where like things are so fast that you basically get images in seconds. And in fact, in the case of ChatGPT is so fast at responding to your prompts that they've actually sort of artificially slowed it down to make it look more human. And while I have a ton of feelings about that, it's clear that these things respond very quickly because of the model that we've built and the speed we built and the technology behind these things, that we're also at places where we get almost real-time art. This has always been something I've been interested in, fascinating in, and hopefully was seeing, and I'm starting to see more and more of these tools. So this is from someone called Dot Simulate on Twitter, and they have a tool now where they're using Touch Designer to create these images, and then that runs through a Stable Diffusion model to generate basically real-time imagery. And when we get to this level, now we've got that scale, now we've got that like different stylistic thing, and we've got real time, and it's going to lead to some really interesting, fascinating sort of real-time video work. And I'm sure not all of it will be great, but I think there's something interesting just in the concept of having that available to you. And obviously the question here is like, are these things good things, right? As artists, I think we also know that there's a benefit to slowing down. But I would also say like we're kind of in this world where we're all beholden to algorithms. And in order to keep our view count up, it's like we have to make a thing a day or whatever. So sometimes, yeah, we do need to actually have scale and speed. Unfortunately, as an artist, I can't go and reinvent Instagram, but I might be able to leverage these tools to keep people interested so that I am then able to, work at a different scale or speed on other projects. And that's sort of how I personally have used these. I can use these tools to work at a higher scale, which means I can do bigger projects, or I can begin to tie stuff to video. So that scale can become, a way to explore areas you wouldn't usually previously. So while I'm sure scale and speed are not for everyone, I do think there's some value in at least exploring it and seeing how it fits into your own practice. All right, let's start talking about some of the negatives. I have a lot of negatives to talk about, and I won't try to bore you with too many of them. The first up here is what I would call, in quotes, hallucinations. If you've never seen a hallucination through ChatGPT, I highly recommend you check out a bunch of stuff that I've got linked in here. I hate calling it hallucinations. I prefer to call it lying, because I think realistically that's kind of what's happening here. Now, realistically, neither of these are true. Machine learning models are not human, so they cannot take drugs and hallucinate. They're not human, so they can't lie to you. So it's more like they're bugs in the program. I think thinking of them as bugs is probably a better way to think about it. Now, in the case of ChatGPT, and here's some funny examples. So like you can ask ChatGPT, when did Leonardo da Vinci paint the Mona Lisa? And it gives you an answer of Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa in 1815, which is incorrect. Now, this is also from March of 2023. I know ChatGPT has improved over the years, but it's still happily, like, it does a lot of this hallucination stuff quite frequently. And I would argue that's actually because we're incorrectly using ChatGPT. ChatGPT as a generative model is meant to generate text that looks real, but isn't actually like told it has to be real. And even through text prompting, I've seen people do some crazy stuff around like trying to get it to not lie to you, et cetera, et cetera. But like the reality is that these tools, like, their idea is they want to make up realistic looking text without it being always realistic. Here's another example. So you can ask ChatGPT to tell me a fact about George Washington, and it says George Washington was known for inventing the cotton gin. Now, I kind of think I know where some of this is coming from, right? It's like mixing up U.S. history and maybe some names of things, but again, it's not true. And for all these negatives, I'm going to try to give you some positives or optimistic ways to look at this. For this one, I just don't have anything. This is human error, which is please do not use generative AI as a search engine. Do not use ChatGPT as a search engine. I see this happen so frequently, and it kind of scares me because search engines are search engines. Generative AI is meant to generate text that looks real but isn't. And quite often I've seen colleagues who jump into using ChatGPT and they say, oh, well, I asked this question. Here's what it told me as an answer. I was like, did you double check that answer? Well, no, because it's ChatGPT. It told me this was the answer. And it's like, man, I wouldn't trust ChatGPT within an inch of my life. Like, it's not, the tool is not made to do that. And I think it's better if we be realistic about that. So hallucinations, lying, making shit up, whatever you want to call it, it's actually the way the model has been trained and the purpose of the model. And it's unfortunate user error that I think is making that the case where we expect things to happen out of it that actually don't. Now, I should also mention, maybe tied to this idea is the concept of deepfakes. Now, deepfakes are, again, I wouldn't say this is a machine problem. I would say this is a human nature problem, right? There will always be people that want to try to fake things, that want to create images that trick people, and deepfakes are certainly a part of that. This is actually from, I think, 2020. This is a New York Times piece that looked at StyleGAN deepfakes back in the day. And looking at these now, you're like, well, clearly these are fake. Like, but at the time, people were still being tricked by these. And now we're at this place where pretty much every day I see someone post an image. Some people think it's real, and everyone else is like, no, that's an AI image. And now I've got to the point where, like, people are posting full-on blog posts on how to tell if an image is real or not. It's only going to get worse. Like, I actually think many of these image tools are actually going to get better and better, and we're going to start to lose the potential for tricks or, like, techniques to find out if these things are fake. People probably know about the six-fingered person, or, like, seeing things blur into each other. And it's actually led to some places where people think images are made by AI, and it turns out they aren't. And there's a whole bunch of, people who treat people very poorly in both directions, whatever. But I think, like, again, this is a human problem. These models are doing their best to generate the best looking images they can. And unfortunately, people are abusing that power. And I don't really have a good answer for that. We've been dealing with, human tricks and that sort of thing probably since the beginning of time, probably since humans started, interacting with each other. We've been trying to trick each other for sometimes humorous reasons and sometimes nefarious reasons. But again, I think this ties to this, and this is just something to look out for and keep an eye on. But again, it isn't really a problem with the model, it's a human nature problem. But I will say, tied to this is, like, this idea of, like, I think sometimes people have seen images that have been made using AI, and they look perfect. And until you look at the details, you don't really recognize how imperfect they are. But then you go and make stuff, and you're like, everything's imperfect, I can't use this. And it's true. Like, most of these models are not yet perfect. I don't know if perfection is ever going to be possible, but it will probably get closer and closer to perfect. Obviously the big one is just, like, things like hands and feet tend to generate multiple appendages. There's other things like, if you go through some of those articles about how to spot AI images, stuff blurring into each other in a weird way. These are the problems of these models. They are not perfect, and I think sometimes people come in and expect perfection, and you just can't. There's really no good way to think about it that way. But there are ways to approach this. I think leaning into the weirdness is something that AI artists for the past couple of years have been really doing a great job of, and only recently have AI artists sort of pushed, or like people that come into AI art have pushed for more realism. I think about Mario Klingemann's work, which is super surreal and other weird ways. My own work has explored weirdness in florals and plant life and that sort of thing. And I think it's an option. It's a way to explore these tools, but you should be aware that, like, you are basically working with the imperfections of the tools and bringing them out. But I kind of love that. I mean, in any of my artwork, I'm trying to lean into what the affordances or imperfections are of these tools to highlight how they work. Another thing you can think about is learn to love inpainting. If you've never explored inpainting, we'll probably cover that more in some of these video lectures. But inpainting is this idea that you can take part of the image and inpaint it with a new prompt or with a slightly more complex prompt to get a better image. And I do know that lots of artists who use AI tools will often generate images and then inpaint out the imperfections. So say they find a 6-fingered hand, they'll inpaint it in that section and try to force it into a 5-fingered hand in many different ways. I know maybe a couple months ago, Adobe released a really good version of inpainting into Photoshop, and I'm now seeing people use that almost like it's just a normal Photoshop tool. So we're also getting to this point where like AI tools and traditional like digital art tools are being blended together and merged, and that's also leading to like, is this AI art? Is it not? Like, what's good? What's bad? Like, conversations that I'm quite honestly not really that interested in. But I do think inpainting is a good option, and we'll definitely look at how to do some of that, because I do think it allows you to remove some of these detail issues, but it also adds time to the amount of time it takes you to create these images. So, 50-50, it's good and bad. And the other thing I've seen a lot of artists do is they will start with generative AI and then polish the final project or add to it. So again, they'll take it into Procreate or they'll take it into Photoshop and add additional pieces to it. Likewise, if you're using ChatGPT, personally, I would never take anything in ChatGPT out as like verbatim. I would always go in and tweak stuff or like make edits to it if I were using those tools in certain purposes. So again, I think sometimes people think that there's a purity of like AI art, like, oh, I just want just the final output, like nothing else. Don't want to tweak it. And I think tweaking it is always a possibility. Like, you're the artist, you get to choose what you want to do with it. Okay, tied to that detailing thing is a control thing. I would say in the 5 or 6 years that I've been teaching AI art to artists and designers, I would say the number one thing I hear from most of them who end up disliking these tools is that it doesn't do exactly what they want, and that's almost more frustrating than it not doing anything at all. And that just means that I think there's an expectation. Again, I think all the AI hype has led us to this place where we think they do exactly what we want them to do, right? We see someone who put in the perfect prompt, so why doesn't our prompt work perfectly? And that's just, again, it's probably more of a human nature thing than it is an AI tool thing. But it's good to remember that these tools are not perfect, and often you want to control a thing. You'll say like, move that arm a little bit more to the right. That'll look great. Or, I want slightly different color palettes. Like, how do I tweak it? And that's where text prompting comes into play. That's where other things come into play. But like, actually, it's just a problem of these tools. And I think they'll improve over time. And there are tools that have come out in the past couple years that are already starting to do this. This is a tool called ControlNet. Again, we'll probably look at some video on how to use this in future sessions. But ControlNet allows you, there's actually 2 AI models put together. So there's an AI model that will probably take you maybe your photographs of, say, a person doing yoga poses, and then convert those into poses. This is pose detection, so it tries to figure out where the arms and the legs are. And you'll notice here, if you actually look at this model, you'll see there's some imperfections in this, right? This leg extends all the way to our hand, but here it doesn't. This one looks like it's figuring out, actually that one's pretty good. So there's some imperfections that are happening here, and then you translate that to the images. ControlNet allows you to take these and then apply that to an image to hopefully maintain the pose. But you'll see even here this isn't perfect, right? This arm is supposed to be pointing in, and this one points out. Again, the legs do kind of weird things here. I noticed that this pose, if you wanted this exact pose, does not really match here, right? This person's kind of twisted a little bit in angle. And this is kind of the problem of these tools. This one's really bad. This one, the arm becomes like a sword or something. I don't even know. So this is better. This is better than what we had 3 years ago. I always have to caveat stuff. I'm always like, I was doing this, I sound like an old man, like, walking to school both ways uphill. But like 3 years ago, we didn't have this stuff and we had to deal with it. And now we've got this stuff which makes it better, but it adds a whole layer of complexity. We have to do more tooling with things. And while I would say it still saves us a lot of time in terms of like me having to learn how to hand paint this or whatever, but it does add complexity. It adds levels of learning that you need to do. And as these models come out with new things, you have to learn the new thing. It's a never-ending war to get more and more realistic, which is why I just kind of default to let's make some weird stuff and we'll deal with the realism. Someone else can deal with that. That's not for me. But again, I think these tools are getting better, and I think we'll see them get better and better. So if you're a person that's coming in that's like, I hate that I don't have full control over this, maybe just wait a year or two and you'll have full control over it. Yeah. And again, like, we're making really complex images with very little time and effort put into it. So maybe, take the positive out of that and don't look too much at the negative. All right, last one I want to talk about is originality. Maybe a little bit of a hot take, but I know right now everyone's talking about how AI steals and AI is theft. I want to take actually this as more of a conceptual conceit, which is that AI is essentially a conservative tool, meaning AI always looks at things that have previously existed and extrapolates from there. When we talk a little bit more about data sets in future sessions, like a data set is always tied to a certain time period, meaning the day that I train the model, let's say a model only takes an hour to train. If I scrape data in that exact amount of time, train it for an hour, it's already looking at the past. And this is definitely true of stuff like ChatGPT. ChatGPT was tied to a certain area when the data was scraped, meaning if you asked it today who won the Grammys a couple days ago, it wouldn't know. And that's because it never scraped that data. Now, it also might make stuff up because it doesn't know that it needs to be defining stuff realistically. But I think it's important to remember this, that like these are conservative with lowercase c tools. They're always looking back. And that means that they cannot, I think there's interesting pastiches. I think there's interesting things that it generates images that look new or have some new idea in them, but that's always grounded in some sort of reality. And you hear people talk about collage, and collage is more of an analogy than an actual fact of how these tools work. They don't cut and paste little pieces of it. They kind of merge ideas and different layers of conceptual concepts in the imagery and put that back together. And that can look new. That can look like it's something that is completely different than you've ever seen before, but it's probably not really. It's probably pulling together a couple of things that make it look different. For example, a couple years ago, one of the most common things people would do to get their images to have a little bit of style and substance to them and interest to them would to be included in their text prompt something like in the style of Greg Rutkowski. I think it's Rutkowski. And here on the left, you'll see an image that is actually by Rutkowski, and on the right are images that these models would generate. I even see similarities, but I wouldn't say they're the same. Maybe this one, with a little bit of that nose structure, has some interesting similarities. But overall, I would say this doesn't have the exact same style of the artist. The artist feels differently. If you want to read this article, the artist was very, very upset about all of this, and I think eventually his prompt was actually removed from a lot of these tools. But again, I think this highlights that, like, the concept of prompting or the concept of using other people's artistic styles in these tools is problematic. There's no other way around it. And originality is probably on a scale, not binary. We're not saying every image is original or not original. We're saying it's like on a gradient. But I would say the key thing to think about this is consider the ethics of exploiting the work of others. I won't get too much into detail of the ethical implications of these tools right now, but I will say, like, from my perspective, we are using the data of other artists or other image makers or other writers, whatever it is. Like, there's no rational way to say we aren't using that data. And by using that data, we are in some ways taking from their own labor. And I think we have to at least acknowledge that and figure out how that works for our own tools. I will say there are also currently instances of things straight up almost outright stealing. Now, from a technical perspective, this is something we would call overfitting. I have videos on what overfitting is if anyone's interested. But this is actually a problem with the model, I would say. Or the model is getting too much incentive to create realistic images that look the exact same. So there's this great thread by this person on X, where they actually go through and show that the newest version of Midjourney as of January was basically outright duplicating images. Now, some of this is because they're prompting and asking for that same image. But I'd argue you still shouldn't get the exact same image out of this when you prompt these. And there's slight differences here, right? You can see that the lighting is different here. Coloring, prompting, etc. is a little bit different. But this one at the top here is pretty close to home. I would feel pretty uncomfortable if my model were making images like this and users could generate this sort of thing and not feel like it's exactly the original. I think in this case, they've also pointed out that even just asking for screen cap gives you images that almost look like direct plagiarisms from the images. And there's obviously going to be a legal issue for the people making these tools, because their argument has always been, well, we don't outright duplicate images. But here we're seeing stuff that's really, really close to that. And again, I would say this is a problem of the tooling. The tools should penalize the model for making images like this and try to keep things more realistic, but it is happening. I think especially Midjourney, who's sort of been known as stylistically someone that a company that makes a model that is very photorealistic, probably like leaning way too much into this and probably needs to think about how to pull back from it. But again, you can generate exact images out of this, and I think like that's a problem long term. And certainly as artists and designers, we want to be aware of like where our images are coming from, right? We don't want to, I mean, these are very, very popular movies, but what if we made something and it generated a piece of artwork that matched some small artist who maybe has 1,000 followers on Instagram, and they see that we've now produced this image and are showing people it and it's theirs? Like, I don't think any of us actually want that to happen. I think realistically, like, we need to think about how to work around that, or what other tooling needs to happen. And I'm sure eventually we will get better tools like that, but today we don't really have a lot of stuff like that. So just something to be aware of, and it's something to keep an eye on. And I think it is a real problem with these tools, like maybe one of the major problems with these tools, and we need to think about how do we avoid that. And I guess you might say, well, nothing is truly original, right? I think that's, it's the common phrase, but I would still argue, like, come on, like, some of this stuff is clearly getting too close to a ripoff or plagiarism or recreating the same images that it should. I bet ChatGPT has the same problem. I bet it sometimes plagiarizes outright full paragraphs, and you might not even know that. And then you're putting it in some document that is maybe being used for your own personal gain, and you might get caught, and you don't know that, and you feel like ChatGPT has sold you down the river. So yeah, I just think it's a huge problem, and that's sort of where we are with these tools. That's sort of it for me. I know I ran a little bit long, or this video became a little bit longer than I was expecting it to, but I think it's really helpful when you come into these tools to start being aware of these things as soon as possible. Because even when we start to actually generate images and generate text and that sort of thing, it's good to always double check ourselves. Like, wait, this sounds like a really famous poem, or this image looks really familiar. So it's always good to be a little bit careful about these things, while also recognizing the huge power that's available to you now. I think there's really cool and amazing things that can be made with this, but it should always be done with caution and thought and care. So that's sort of a quick overview of what I think works well with AI and what doesn't. We'll talk about this more as we go through these series of videos.